Chapter 3, Society and Culture in Provincial America. We're still talking about the English colonies, but now we're going to be looking more at the people that actually live within the colonies. So in this chapter, we'll be talking about the makeup of the colonial population and how it shifts from being predominantly English to including other groups. We'll talk about the origins of North American slavery, and then lastly, we'll talk about two very important social movements in the American colonies, the American Enlightenment and the Great Awakening. But first, let's talk about colonial life. As we mentioned earlier, most English settlers came over as indentured servants. That is, they sold their future labor in order to pay passage for the journey from Europe over to the New World. And as we mentioned, not all came voluntarily. In addition to people who wanted to come, England in particular also shipped over prisoners and orphans, people who were indigent, that is, maybe they were jobless or homeless. All of these sorts of people came over, and again, some of them were transported over against their will, and then once they got here, they did face a very difficult life, whether that was due to starvation risks or hostilities with Native Americans or disease. And after the year 1670, we do begin to see this flood of English immigrants begin to taper off for several reasons. Number one, the biggest reason is that the situation in England began to improve. That is, if things aren't quite as bad back home in England, if the conditions aren't as bad, it's not going to drive as many people over to the New World. And the second thing is the English birth rate began to decline, and so they didn't have as many people to send over. They began worrying about losing too much labor, and so the number of English began to taper off. That being said, even though the English stopped coming over, that slack is picked up by other groups of people. The number of immigrants is boosted by other non-English sources. For example, Scotland and Ireland, and especially Germany. And as a result of these different sources of immigration, America becomes a very diverse place. Now, a lot of people like to call America a melting pot. You know, it's kind of this idea that American culture is this unique fusion of all the different cultures that immigrants have brought with them, and so it all joins together in this giant pot and something new comes out of it. And that's not strictly true, not in America today, and certainly not in the American colonies of the English Empire. What we see happening is not really a melting pot, it's more like a mosaic. A mosaic is a picture that when you step back, you see the work of art as a whole. But the closer you get to it, you can see the sharply delineated, you can see the sharp edges of the different pieces of color that make up the picture. And that's exactly what was happening in the American colonies. These ethnicities, the English would stick together, the Germans would stick together, the Irish would stick together. So you might have entire villages and towns of people from Scotland, and they spoke Scottish. 10 miles down the road, you might have a German village where everyone ate German food and dressed in German fashion and spoke the German language. So I don't want you to assume that everyone mixed together and they began sharing all their culture, because that didn't necessarily happen. The ethnicities tended to stick together, and we even see that in the United States today. I think there's much more fusion in the United States today, but we still have places like Chinatowns and German towns and Little Italies. So that still happens even in the United States today. The other thing I want you to be aware of is that as these different groups begin to move in, it is especially hard for Native Americans because, again, their culture is being assaulted from all sides. Now, we mentioned that New England in particular is very strongly conformist. There are expected ideas about how people should live their lives at every stage of their life. When you're a child, you're expected to do this. When you're a teenager, you're expected to do that. As a young man or woman, you're expected to do these other things. So in New England, society is incredibly strongly conformist. And when you combine that with the fact that the Puritans have a very supernatural view of the world, for example, when a Puritan farmer lost his crop, It wasn't because it was, blighted by a infestation of boll weevils or whatever. It was because he had offended God in some way. When a child became sick, it wasn't because their bodies were fighting off a germ. It was because they were being tormented by demons. So whatever was happening in their world, the Puritans tended to see the reasons for those occurrences as supernatural. And taking that one step further, whenever bad luck happens, so-called witches are to blame. And as you might expect, the purported witches are those that did not fit into this strongly conformist society. For example, it may be an older woman who wants to live alone without being married. It may be a younger woman who doesn't want to get married and instead wants to own her own business. These groups of people, and I should mention they're not always women, men were accused as well. These people don't fit into the pigeonholes of New England society, and since they do stick out, they make easy targets. And of course, as we all know, the late 1600s, Salem, Massachusetts, we have just such an occurrence. Young girls began falling ill. They began suffering hallucinations and seizures. And in the search for what was happening, the fingers were pointed at supposed witches. When those witches were spoken to, and they were forced to give up others in their group in order to take the heat off of themselves, they willingly gave up others. And so it snowballed. 2 witches might be accused, and in order to get the accusers off their backs, those 2 witches might point at 5 other people. And then when those 5 people are questioned, they might point at 20 other people. And so you can just see it snowballs out of control. And in the end, hundreds of people had been accused of witchcraft, and several had even been put to death. If I remember correctly, 19 women and 1 man were put to death either by hanging or burned at the stake. One was even pressed to death. They were held down and rocks were piled on their body until they died. You can see here, this is an oil painting of an accusation in the Salem witch trials. You see the young woman in the center. She's being forced to show her back. One of the distinguishing marks of a witch, supposedly they had weird skin formations, odd patches of skin. In any way, you can see the older lady is pointing to one of these supposed witch marks, and the surrounding crowd is reacting with shock and dismay. So anyway, eventually it gets to the point when you have hundreds of people being accused, they realize that certainly not that many witches could have been living under their noses the entire time. The whole thing sort of falls apart, but again, not before a tragic loss of life. Let's talk about the origins of American slavery, and I want you guys to realize that the American colonies were not founded with slavery in mind. No one said, hey, let's move to the New World and start a colony because we can have slaves. That wasn't the thing. Slavery occurs gradually over time, mainly for more economic reasons than moral or racism reasons. And the simple truth of it was, to the colonists, slaves made more sense. Economically speaking, slaves were slaves for life. An indentured servant you had to let go after 5 to 7 years. The offspring of slaves were slaves, not the case with indentured servants. So it made more sense to the colonists to use slavery than indentured servants, if only for purely economical reasons. Now, here's how it changes. Here's the thing. As we've mentioned before, the world has a long history of slavery. Ever since the dawn of mankind, one man has tried to overpower and use other men for their own gain. Okay, fine. Greece and Rome were built on the backs of slaves. The Egyptian Empire was built on the backs of slaves. Slavery has a very long history in the world. The thing that changes with the New World from Old World slavery is very different in that slaves still have some rights. It's not necessarily hereditary. You don't necessarily pass it on to your children. For example, in the Old World, a slave might be a slave because he owed a debt. You owe too much money, you can't pay it, and so you're sold into slavery to pay that debt. Well, working on your own, you could earn a little bit of money along the way. And once you saved up enough money, you could buy your own freedom. That's not necessarily an option with New World slaves. Old World slavery was not necessarily based on race. It was based on, did you owe money, or were you captured as a prisoner of war, or something along those lines. So Old World slavery and New World slavery, there are significant differences. I want you to realize that it doesn't begin necessarily in North America. Slavery in the New World really does begin in sugar plantations in Brazil and in the Caribbean. And what happened was, sugar is a very labor-intensive product. It takes a lot of manpower to grow it, to harvest it, to process it, to ship it. It takes a lot of people working on these sugar plantations. Now, originally, they did enslave Native Americans, but due to violence, due to disease, the Native American populations are being killed off rather quickly. And so they didn't have enough labor from Native Americans. The white settlers didn't want to do it because it was a horribly taxing life. I think the life expectancy of a slave who was shipped to the New World was something like 2 to 3 years. They were only expected to live 2 to 3 years because of the horrific conditions on these sugar plantations. So they didn't have enough Native Americans. The white settlers didn't want to do it, so they turned to African slaves. And African slaves have been bought and sold on the global market for hundreds of years at this point. It really got its start with Muslim traders. So African slavery, they didn't invent the idea of African slavery. They just took them from other parts of the world and brought them to the New World. And once that occurred, it does expand very quickly to the tune of tens of thousands of African slaves being brought into the New World every year. And as you might expect, slavery becomes a huge part of commerce in the New World. Now, the term triangular trades is probably a more simplified view of it. A better way of describing it might be a web, but for our purposes, we'll use triangular trades. And there existed a triangle between the colonies of the New World, the Old World mother countries, and Africa, where you would have the movement of goods and slaves and money that moved in a triangular fashion around the Atlantic Ocean. And another thing I want you guys to realize is that even low slavery areas were impacted. For example, in the American North, in the Northern American colonies, places like Massachusetts Bay or Rhode Island or Connecticut. These places are too far north, and the soil is not good enough to support the huge plantations like you see in the American South and in the Caribbean and in Brazil. So they didn't have the need for this manpower that slavery provided. And so later on, it's easier for them to say, we don't have the history of slavery that the southern states do. But that's not true, because most of these slave traders, the people that did the buying and selling of slaves, most of them exist in the North because the North is more commercial than the South. So I don't want you to think that simply because a place doesn't have large numbers of slaves working that they had nothing to do with slavery, because that's not true. Even low slavery areas were impacted by this huge slave trade. Now I want you to realize that Africa played a role in the slave trade as well. Coastal African tribes made friends with the Europeans. They actively hunted other Africans to sell to the European traders. You have to remember that Africa is a huge place with millions of people, countless cultures and language, and rivalries that span hundreds, if not thousands of years. Not everyone on the continent of Africa gets along. They're not all the same people. And so it was easy for these coastal tribes to raid further inland, people they didn't know, people they had nothing in common with. They didn't speak the same language. They didn't practice the same religions. It was relatively easy for these Africans to capture other Africans to sell to traders. And again, African slavery is not the same thing as New World slavery, so they might not have even realized what they were selling fellow Africans into. The transport between Africa and the New World is known as the Middle Passage, and it was truly a horrific journey, with death rates as high as 20%. Slaves were packed into boats like sardines. Horrific living conditions, and the slave traders, they chalked this up to the cost of doing business. They said, we know we're going to lose 10 to 20% of our slaves on the passage, so we want to pack as many as possible into the boats to maximize our profits. They never thought if they shipped slaves in a more humane fashion that a greater percentage of them might survive the journey. They weren't concerned about that. You have to remember, slaves were viewed as property. Slaves were viewed the same as a cow or a horse or a sheep, right? So the slavers did not have any particular qualms about the standards that they treated their slaves to. Slavery explodes. Slavery grows very quickly in the Caribbean. It grows more slowly in North America. And early on, the legal status of slaves in North America is rather ambiguous. There weren't a lot of slaves. Nobody really sat down and thought about what the legal status of slaves was. So in the early years, when there aren't very many slaves, it's rather ambiguous. Can you set them free? Can they buy their own freedom? Do they have any rights? These are questions that aren't answered. But as more and more slaves arrive in what is the future United States, the clearer that delineation became. And it quickly became, these are slaves, they have no rights. And that was due to the numbers of slaves arriving in the New World. Part of this was the event known as Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion really initially doesn't have anything to do with slavery. It has to do with indentured servants. And what was happening was there are large numbers of indentured servants who are gaining their freedom, and they want land, and they want recognition of their rights from the local government. And that is putting a large stress on the people that already own the land. So Bacon's Rebellion really has to do more with non-landowners and landowners than it has to do with slavery. But the reason that it's important to slavery is because after Bacon's Rebellion, people realized that slaves don't have these rights. And these kinds of questions aren't being raised by slaves. And so wouldn't life be much simpler if we just used more slaves instead of indentured servants? So after Bacon's Rebellion, that really accelerates the movement towards African slavery away from indentured servants, because you didn't owe slaves anything like you might with indentured servants. And again, as more and more slaves arrive in the American colonies, we quickly see that it quickly becomes a racial issue instead of a slavery status issue. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with whether or not you were a slave. It had to do with your race. As more and more slaves are imported, the white owners began to fear that they would become outnumbered, they would become victim to slave revolts, and so they created very rigid systems to control their slaves. And the easiest way to define who is a slave and who is not a slave was race and skin color. And so that is what many of the laws became based on. In 1705, the House of Burgesses, which is in Virginia, makes a new slave code. And for the first time in 1705, that distinction is based on race rather than, say, national origin or the language you speak or the status as a prisoner of war. In 1705, it becomes all about race. And as I said, with the consolidation of slavery comes stricter laws, where not only slavery laws are based on race, but your race in general is subjected to very strict laws. Race became the social division. So it doesn't matter if you are a slave or not. That is no longer the distinction. Now the distinction is what is the color of your skin. We see the Stono Rebellion, which is one of the earliest known slave rebellions, and it is the largest slave rebellion up until the American Revolution. And as a result of the Stono Rebellion, we see several different things come into being. For example, we see restrictions on assembly and education of slaves. An educated slave is a dangerous slave, so they were not allowed to be educated anymore. We saw a 10-year ban on new slaves. The idea was that slaves that had been in the system for a while, their spirit was broken and they were much less likely to rebel. So we don't want to import slaves who might have fresher ideas of freedom. They just lost their freedom, so they have more passion and more fire to get it back. So there was a ban on new slaves. You had to be granted approval to set your slaves free. That it wasn't enough just to want to set your slaves free. You had to get government permission to set your slaves free. And interestingly enough, penalties against owners for harsh treatment. The idea was if you make slave life easier, they will be less likely to rebel. That was the idea behind that one, but of course it was not necessarily strictly enforced. Now this does bring up an interesting historiographical question about slavery. And that question is slavery the result of racism or did it cause it? And what I mean by that is, were slaves because they were Africans, or was it because they were Africans they became slaves? Oscar Handlin said in 1950 that slavery was not permanent because of race. It had nothing to do with race. It had everything to do with the need to secure labor. Winthrop Jordan in 1968 says no, it had everything to do with race. And the reason that Africans had become slaves is because Europe had a long history of discrimination against Africans. So you have one historian in 1950 saying that race had nothing to do with it. It had to do with the labor supply. And then you have one in 1968 who says, yes, it completely hinges on race. And the reason why I point this out is because I want you to think about what happened between 1950 and 1968 in the United States. And of course, if you know anything about that time period, that is the modern civil rights movement. 1950 is pre-civil rights movement. 1968 is post-civil rights movement. And so the fact that that movement occurred over 15 to 20 years, what I'm pointing at is that when a historian writes history, their biases become evident. And having lived through the civil rights movement, Jordan might have been much more likely to label race as a factor than Handlin, because race wasn't as big an issue when he was writing his history. So that's something that I just want you to think about. Let's talk about the Consumer Revolution. We said that the English Empire would be built on trade, not necessarily finding gold and silver like the Spanish did, but they would still get rich, only it was off of trade rather than precious metals. The English quickly displaced the Dutch as the world's largest trading network. They do more global commerce than any other country on the planet. British goods are very popular in the American colonies. The American colonies produce some goods, but nothing that could compare to British. And the American colonies remain overwhelmingly rural. Again, it's all part of that triangular trade system. Now, in general, the American population is much more equal than, say, the population of Europe. For example, in the American colonies, there are no legal social ranks. There are no lords and ladies and barons and counts and viceroys in the American colonies. Everyone is on the same legal footing. That being said, we still have groups of elites. You have the merchants in the north and the planter class in the south. These are men of means that still control the government. So even though, on a whole, American society is more equal than Europe, it is still stratified. There are still those at the top of the ladder and those on the bottom rung. And the interesting about this is, and this is pretty important, is that most elites in America have more in common with the British than they have in common with other Americans. You have to realize that the American colonies are strongly independent. Rhode Island, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Virginia, South Carolina, they don't like one another. They don't like having to work together with one another. And so what would happen is that you see, for example, the people of Virginia, they have more in common with, and they feel closer to people back in England than they have any sort of bond with people in, say, Massachusetts, because their lives are drastically different. The life of a merchant in Massachusetts living in Boston and the life of a plantation owner in South Carolina are going to be drastically different. And they may feel more in common with those people still living in England than they do with their fellow colonists. And that's important because these feelings are going to hurt effort to act in unison later. It's going to hurt the unification efforts. As we build up to the Civil War, we will see that the colonies resist every effort to bind them together and make them a unified whole. They simply don't want to do it. Okay. All that being said, most people in the colonies live in a growing middle class, and the reason for that is mainly the wide distribution of land. Being able to freely get land puts people on a level playing field. There is more land available in the New World. That's the number one reason most immigrants come to the New World. It allows you to control your own labor. It allows you to engage in the political process. This wide distribution of land put most people on an even playing field for the first time. And because of that, people begin to regard land not as a privilege, like they might have regarded it back in Europe where land is scarce, but they come to demand it as a right. Land is theirs because it belongs to them by virtue of being a right. And so if someone is standing in your way of owning that land, such as Native Americans or other countries that claim that land, or maybe even your own colonial government who's trying to keep you in check, if someone is standing in your way, that is seen as a denial of your rights, and that's a pretty big deal, which leads us into these two social movements, the American Enlightenment and the Great Awakening. The Enlightenment movement is a social movement that actually comes to the New World from Europe. The Enlightenment is a social movement that occurs in the mid-1600s up through the 1700s. And what happens is the Enlightenment is a movement away from tradition. People begin to question, why are we doing these things? We shouldn't be doing these things simply because it's the way it's always been done. We should use reason. Does this thing make logical sense to do? If it doesn't, we should not be doing it. We should not be doing things simply because we've always been doing these things. And so the institutions that rely on the use of traditions, such as churches and political institutions, these things are going to come under fire. People begin to ask, well, why are we doing this in church? Doesn't make logical sense. If it doesn't make logical sense, then we shouldn't be doing this thing anymore. It's the use of reason and logic to govern human lives. And that sort of thinking is going to have a very big impact on the American colonies. Several Enlightenment thinkers, for example, John Locke and his theory of natural rights, that is going to play a huge role in the American Revolution. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But John Locke's natural rights argument is going to be the blueprint for the American Revolution. The Baron de Montesquieu, who was a French thinker, he wrote about the separation of powers and the importance of constitutionalism, the idea that you should write your government down. Obviously, the separation of powers is going to play a huge role in the American government. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who wrote about the general will and popular sovereignty, how government ought to follow the will of the people. That's a huge idea in the American government. And so a lot of these Enlightenment thinkers really have a pretty big impact on the American colonists, and they'll use a lot of these Enlightenment ideals in creating their own government later on. Now, the flip side of that is the movement known as the Great Awakening, because religion is still incredibly important in the American colonies. And a lot of the American ministers are worried that America is becoming too secular. Secular means non-religious, that America is moving too far away from religion. People stopped going to church. People stopped worrying about religion. And so the Great Awakening essentially is a revival movement. It's developed to get people interested in going back to church. And the way that it did this, the way that it sold the idea of church to the American people, the American colonists, was it sold the idea of a more emotional and personal faith. They in some ways, they agreed with Enlightenment. They would say that you shouldn't keep doing these traditions without knowing why. Just going through the motions is not enough. That's the sort of thing that the Great Awakening would argue, that you must have a more personal, direct face-to-face sort of relationship with your religion. And this really challenges some of the churches, because essentially what these Great Awakening ministers are preaching is that you may not need church anymore. You may not need to go through the structure of the church in order to have this more personal faith with God. And so essentially what ends up happening from the opposite ends, the Enlightenment is all about secularism, the Great Awakening is all about religion. Starting at opposite ends, they actually meet in the middle, and both of these movements are about enlarging the boundaries of liberty, whether that is enlarging your liberty from a government standpoint or enlarging your liberty from a religious standpoint. That is the net result, is that it gets more people talking about the idea of liberty in the American colonies. They're enlarging the boundaries of liberty. All right, and